Thank you, everybody, for coming to, I think, the fourth edition of Civic Future Secford series. I think I left a card on everybody's seat, so please have a look. If you're not already, sign up to our newsletter and also have a look on our website and find out a lot more about Civic Future. Just a very brief rundown. We were founded in November last year to essentially identify and train and widen the amount of people going into public life and engaging them with the big moral, technological and philosophical questions of the day. And we have a fellowship, a one-year fellowship, but we also put on a series of public and private events on many of the big challenges that we're facing as liberal democracies. And state capacity is one of those things that has been coming up frequently. For most people, what is state capacity? And that's one of the things that we want to explore today. But many people would argue that it's essentially the ability of government to achieve its goals. And for the last few years, it's familiar to many that there's been lots of things that we've wanted to achieve, whether that's improving the health service, the transport infrastructure, growing the economy. But there's been a prevailing sense across the country that the things that we want to achieve, we are not achieving that. And why is that? Is it something wrong with the system? Do we have the wrong people in government? What are those questions and answers to those questions around why we have challenges in state capacity? So we have brought together a very esteemed panel, and I'm very, very excited to hear their perspectives on many of these things today. So we have Joe Hill. He is an engagement manager at Faculty AI, and he is soon to be a policy director at the Reform think tank, so congratulations on that new role. He's also worked in senior roles within the civil service, including the Home Office and the Treasury. We also have Sam Dumitriu. He is the head of policy at Britain Remade, and this is a new campaign organisation which is focused on reinvigorating Britain's economy in a wide range of areas. And you've also worked in a range of think tanks across Westminster, including the Entrepreneurs Network, on a wide range of subjects such as immigration, technology and education. We also have Bryan Cheang, who is the Assistant Director of the Centre for the Study of Governance and Society at King's College London. He is currently researching the challenges around industrial policy schemes across different parts of the world. And Bryan also brings his experience from policy as a civil servant, is that right, in Singapore? Amazing. And we also have Munira next to me, who is the Chief Executive of Civic Future, and she has worked in senior roles across local and national government, including the Head of Policy at Number 10 Downing Street. So before we get into the discussion, just some quick house rules. So we'll have opening challenges and provocations, 5 to 10 minutes each from our speakers, and then we'll have a chaired discussion for another 20 minutes to half an hour, and then we will open it up to the floor for the remainder of the time, so between half an hour and 45 minutes. So please ask lots of questions. We really want to have a vibrant and lively discussion. So I think that is it. There is also Prosecco complimentary at the end, so feel free to have that before you run off home after the evening. So we will start with Joe. Thank you.
Thanks, Inaya. Can you all hear me okay at the back? Great. If you can't, I'm slightly losing my voice. Just wave manically and I'll try and take it up a little bit. I think there's a lot wrong with our country at the moment, and I think you would probably agree with me. If you don't, I don't know why you're here other than a nice evening in a pub. I think where I want to depart from that kind of general feeling is persuading you tonight that it's probably fixable. And I think where the concern about state capacity comes from, different to kind of other political debates, is that I think it's fixable because it's not to do with sort of left-wing politics or right-wing politics, but to do with something else. I think Inaya's definition just now is really great. I'd maybe add to it that I think, along with states not being able to do the things they say they'll do, particularly our state, I think we're seeing like a degradation in the state's ability to do really basic stuff and a degradation in its ability to respond to crises. And I want to persuade you that's really fixable. But I think it's easy to talk about this in abstract, and I want to make it concrete. So maybe like 3 quick examples. We're running out of places to put criminals. So we're at like 98% prison capacity in England and Wales right now. We're forecast to bust through that in a couple of years' time. We are trying to build a lot of prisons. It's taking a really long time. Sam's actually probably going to tell you about some of the reasons we can't do that, because the same is why we can't build anything. But it takes like maybe 4 years from finding a site to being able to build a prison. If we fail and we don't build enough, then we'll start letting people out early, even earlier than we let quite a lot of them out already. And that's going to be really bad. We're going to let people out of prison early because we couldn't build buildings that our great-great-grandparents could build. The second is that we're running out of shells to fight wars. We're supplying our allies in Ukraine with shells. We've given them about, I think, less than a tenth of what they've used in the war to date. And the Defence Select Committee thinks it'll take us about 10 years to replace the ones we've already given them. This isn't a war we're fighting directly, they're our allies, but we are slowly exhausting supplies, which will take a decade to build back up. And I think we're also really struggling at our most basic job, which is kind of keeping people alive. The COVID inquiry is getting into this, and we'll get more into it. But even if you wind the clocks back before COVID, the signs were really bad. There's an American think tank called the Commonwealth Fund, which does a kind of comparative study of healthcare systems in the developed world. And in 2019, 2020, it ranked us as the best. We came top of 4 categories and bottom in one of them. Unfortunately, the one we came bottom in was avoidable deaths. The only people who beat us on avoidable deaths or beat us, but did worse than us on avoidable deaths, were the United States, where they don't have a universal healthcare system and they have a massive opioid epidemic. So even back then, the signs were we were not doing a great job at keeping people alive. It's degraded significantly since then. But those were all surface issues of what I think are common structural problems. And I think to grapple with state capacity, you need to get into the common problems rather than just dealing with the surface issues. I think there are maybe 3. I think we're really struggling to build new things, the kind of things that take capital expenditure, the kind of things that take time are a bit of a gamble. The state is just failing to do those. But even things which aren't physical, building new teams, building new kind of concepts or doing new scientific research, we're really struggling to do. We're struggling to run public services well, to a consistently high standard. And I think particularly struggling to adopt new technology and new ways of doing things. Most of our public services look very similar to how they did 40, 50 years ago, maybe with some exceptions. The rest of our economy and society has largely moved on. I think that's an issue. And I think the final one is when our institutions fail at doing these things, we're not very good at building new institutions. I know that's a lot of the work of Civic Future and a lot of the reason people are here, but we know that over time, most organizations struggle to sustain the kind of performance they had early on. And I think we're really struggling to replace those with new ones. Britain actually has a great track record on founding new institutions. BBC, NHS, the modern police forces in the Met, and we seem to have stopped that and not be continuing to do it. My kind of take on why it's not been fixed already is that you might think we live in a democracy, fixing these things would be popular, democracy is great error correcting systems, why haven't we done that? I think my answer is that in the short term, it's really to everyone's advantage to maintain the status quo. And it takes the kind of long-term thinking, which we can't really collaborate to do. Traditionally, the right in this country has been very skeptical of big government that can do things and wanted to let markets sort it out. I think the left has been very pro-big government traditionally, but kind of suspicious of government that can act quickly and decisively, often because of concerns about violation of individual rights or civic rights. And then there's a whole bunch of other people who are in the system who actually state dysfunction works quite well for. A lot of big legal cases cost a lot of money. That money goes to people. A lot of big independent reviews, consultations, these take time. And there are a lot of people who make a living off of state dysfunction. I think if we're going to fix that, we need to really grapple with that political economy. And I have some ideas about how we do it. If you wanted to build more, you'd start exempting the state from some of the restrictions it's put on itself to build things. That feels obvious, although I'm sure Sam will tell me it's not in a little bit. If you wanted to run public services better, you'd think about keeping people in post longer, trying to promote expertise, sorting out pay, which is a nightmare. Like, we have a system in this country where in the Whitehall, in the civil service, if you want a pay rise, you basically have to move jobs. I think if you think of like really successful groups of people who did great things, like Jobs and Wozniak, or Pierre and Marie Curie, like these people worked together for a really long time, right? They didn't like move jobs every 18 months because they needed to get more money to be able to afford a house in London. Although, I don't know, if they're trying to afford a house in London, I don't think the civil service would continue to be the place to work. And I think if we wanted to build new institutions, I think we'd just start doing that more, right? I think we would show the kind of entrepreneurials we did with things like the government digital service, with the free schools movement, the vaccine task force. I hope with ARIA, we could do all those things, and I think we should. And I guess, like, why am I hopeful that we'll do that as a kind of rounding off of this? I think that political calculus I talked about early on, that it works really well for some people to keep the current status quo going, is actually shifting, because I think the bar is just really low now. And actually, the rewards for people who can pick it up and show that government can build great state capacity so it can do all of these problems we talked about, and really try and solve them, those rewards are huge now. And at some point, people are going to start realizing that and trying to engineer a state which can fix these things. Other reasons I'm hopeful are, I actually think there's like a nascent recognition that many more people care about this and want to do it. You're all in this room, which is great. But it goes wider into a lot of places you wouldn't think it did. A friend of mine wrote a report recently for Reform. I promise I'm not plugging my future employers too much, which was on the experiences of civil servants during the time I was in government. And you would be amazed at the number of people who essentially said to her some variation of, I don't agree with Dominic Cummings on much, but I do agree with him that the state needs to change, is terribly bad, terribly run, and he has the right ideas to fix it. Like, you'd be amazed at the number of people that said something like that to her, for people you wouldn't expect at all. So those are kind of the reasons I'm helpful. And my final plug would be that I think none of the ideas I've talked about are new, but putting them into practice needs people to be brave. And like Peter Thiel has this great line that courage is in shorter supply than genius, and I think it's really true. Like, to do these kind of big things, we need people to go into government wanting to be really brave and make them happen. The ideas are out there, it's just the will to do them. Thank you.
Thank you. Before we go to the next speaker, these stools should be able to take 4 people. So if you can budge up a little bit, and some people at the back that are standing, there should be a couple spaces here for you. Do you want to? Perfect. Thanks so much. So, over to you, Sam.
Cool. Thank you for having me, and thanks for hosting this discussion. I think it's a really important topic, and one that's probably under-discussed relative to a lot of questions in policy and politics. So as someone coming from a think tank background, I think what I've definitely underappreciated at the start, at least, was that when trying to influence policy, the how to is almost as important as the what should we do. So why can't we get stuff done? I think it comes down to 2 sort of broad categories. So on the one hand, you have the qualities of our institutions, our bureaucracy, and our politicians, but then on the other, you have the incentives they face. So before I start, I should just mention that as well as working for a campaign group that talks a lot about infrastructure projects, I also happen to be advising DLUC on infrastructure right now on a temporary basis, and as such I have to watch what I say, so I cannot speak about anything I'm directly working on. So if you want to ask anything about pylons right now, you might have heard about in the papers, I literally am not allowed to say anything, so I just have to rule that out. So the core insight that my colleague Sam Richards sort of had when we started Britain Remade was that when he was in government, there were politicians and there were advisors who had broadly speaking, the right ideas and they had a will to get things done. But what they lacked was that the problem was the political incentives weren't favourable. And they weren't favourable because the kind of big economic reforms you need to pass to deliver the kind of change that people keep voting for, the sort of, people have voted for some pretty extreme things over the past sort of pretty radical shifts in government. And I think the reason they've done that is because there's a recognition that the current system isn't working great. But to do that kind of big change, most of these policies are going to have losers as well as winners. And while the benefits are very much dispersed, loads of people will get an extra, minute or two saved on their journey time, perhaps, while the cost of having a huge development right next to you in a new station, that causes really, really big disruption. And those problems sort of come up again and again. And so as a result, the people who lose out that when a new development or a new change goes ahead, speak out, they write to their MPs, and they have their voices heard. And ultimately, politicians with this distorted view, where they sort of hear from the people who don't want things built, but they never hear from the people who do want things built because typically they're not focused on this individual project, they tend to lose their nerve, and the changes that we need don't end up happening. So as a result, we have a system where, despite pretty significant policy support in terms of subsidies, in terms of targets, in terms of just positive statements from government, you have something like offshore wind where it still takes 13 years to go from sort of start to finish, despite the fact that construction only takes 2 because of a planning system that takes about 5 or 6 years. You have an absurd situation where to the planning application for a road tunnel going between Kent and Essex cost more than Norway spent on the world's longest road tunnel. And it's not even close either. It's not they're roughly about you could basically build the world's longest road tunnel and the world's deepest subsea tunnel, which is a separate project for what it cost the planning application for the Lower Thames crossing. Again, an example of perhaps the system isn't working how anyone intentioned. And you have things like environmental impact assessments that can stretch to 10,000 plus pages. I don't think, again, that was an intention of anyone, but this is kind of the status quo. But trying to reform these things is very tricky. So Britain Remade kind of exists as a sort of group to provide a voice to those who actually do want stuff to get built. They do want that broad economic change, whether that's new transport links, new housing, or new energy supply. And we've sort of done a mix, right? We've sort of campaigned on the general issues, but we've also gone quite specific, and we sort of dived into things like, why has the UK not dualled the A1 yet? If you remember when Dominic Cummings first wrote his blog, one of the requests for people were project managers who can get the A1 dualled in record time. It's not been done. It's still waiting for planning permission, despite it being a recruitment ad effectively in 2019. And we've also sort of looked at lots of ones. And in a lot of cases, when we actually do these sort of specific campaign projects, we actually get almost universally positive feedback. In fact, I think the only negative feedback we got when we were doing one which was campaigning for a new bridge in Anglesey, where the last 2 bridges were built in the 19th century, and they can't really deal with a lot of heavy traffic and a bit of wind, basically, so often get very backed up. And the only negative feedback we got was genuine suspicious, why has no one come from London before and tried to do this? Is this a thing? Are you going to trick us into something? So in general, there's a lot of support. So on the incentive front, I think the role is we need groups like ours, but things like Priced Out, YIMBY Alliance, these sort of campaign groups that can sort of mobilise support for new development and that kind of change. But that's only part of the solution. We also need to recognise that you can design ways of avoiding this problem where you have you have lots of people benefiting a little bit in ways that are basically hypothetical, and lots of people losing out, and a few people losing out in very concentrated ways that are enough to make them write to their MP. You can design better systems, things like street votes, where a street can all vote together to give everyone on the street planning permission, so everyone on the street becomes, in some parts of London, a millionaire overnight. You could do things where making sure that reform isn't all or nothing by allowing certain people to opt out of reforms. This has worked in Houston for upzoning housing there. But these kind of things are part of it, but there's also the question about our institutions. So I've not been working in government long, but something that's been really eye-opening to me is how many potential veto points there are to get sort of anything done, particularly in my area of policy, but I assume in lots of areas of policy. You have to get sign-off from multiple departments. Typically, the people you're asking to sort of approve something have no incentive in what you're working on. It's like a small aspect of what they're doing. And unless you have someone from the centre, such as in Number 10 or Treasury, saying, this is something we need to get done, basically people will drag their feet, not through any malice, but because they're focused on other things. So just the basic bandwidth of Number 10 and the bandwidth of the centre, I think, is a really crucial point. And finding ways to make that better, I think, would be a really important thing. And I also think this creates an incentive issue. So if you're a sort of bright, enterprising civil servant, you're not going to want to waste your time on a policy that requires about 3 different people to say yes, and probably one of them will say no or push it back or water it down at some point. You're going to focus directly on the levers your department can pull. So you end up going down different paths. This might be why someone focuses particularly on regulation as a means to solve a problem, because they can't get permission from Treasury to come up with the sort of tax side of the answer or get the spending side of the answer in. And I think that's a big issue. And while I do think that most civil servants are constructive and, to be honest, actually have pretty good understanding of policy issues, there are a few issues. So, and this is, again, Joe, you made this point, right? The specialism. People are jumping from role to role. So you see a lot of policy ideas that aren't particularly brilliant. I'd give an example, the flat rate pension relief idea, that all pensions should move, the tax relief on pensions should be flat, basically gets suggested every 3 or 4 budgets. Someone from the IFS will eventually write an article saying this isn't a great idea, it gets dropped, and someone from the Telegraph will also say this is a big raid on working people's pensions and it's basically immoral and dishonest and wrong. And they're actually right on this, I think, but that will just go up. But that idea sort of comes up every few years, and you get lots of ideas like this where someone who's just come into the role is like looking for all the options lying around, and they hear that and then they'll go for it. But if you had someone in department for 4 or 5 years, they'd probably say, actually, we've tried this before, it's a bad idea, we're going to focus on things that might have a chance of not getting knocked down at the last minute. And I think that's particularly a problem, though, not just in policy, but in terms of in terms of actual delivery of projects. So one of the things you see with something like delivery of transport projects is because we don't do things a lot as a country, we don't build lots and lots of high-speed rail, we don't electrify lots and lots of rail, we don't build tram after tram after tram. There's none of that expertise, and there's a lot of relearning each time we do something. And I think one of the issues here is that it means that we're very reliant on taking the word of consultants and taking the word of construction companies. So we are very bad at actually having surveillance on these projects, so that taxpayer gets value for money. Different countries have different systems. Italy is much more driven in terms of people who are actual engineers and actual project managers will spend their entire career just focusing on monitoring infrastructure projects. So as a result, they're actually really good at keeping the costs down. You probably don't think of like Italy as the example of building infrastructure, but like in terms of like building metros, and they build a lot, and they're almost all driverless as well, they do them much cheaper on a per mile basis than us. Now I'm sure there's lots of complications here, but that's another example. So And then I think finally, as well as the lack of expertise, there's also a lack of, I think, one specific part of expertise, which is that you can have an understanding of what policies are right and wrong, but part of good policy isn't just coming up with the right solution over a bunch. It's also making sure that solution is politically stable. So what you see in somewhere like California is they've had an enormous success in terms of campaigners have had lots of different policy wins on making it easier to build housing. But they've not actually seen a big uptick in house building. And the reason for that is areas start using little used things like in the environmental assessment process or historical preservation in ways that weren't what they were intended for, but as a means of blocking development. So unless you solve that political problem of making sure that people who are going to run for re-election feel that they're not going to get just loads of angry letters constantly, you're going to get these things sort of re-emerging, and you can kind of see, okay, maybe we can't block this big infrastructure project. Maybe we can require so many different environmental add-ons or different route changes that it becomes so expensive that someone cancels it down the line. That's the kind of thinking you need to be working on and solving. And I think that's probably the expertise where is in very limited supply. It's probably just in limited supply in general, but it would really go far in the civil service if we can bring more people in government who think like that, which probably thinking a bit like a politician as well. So maybe they leave the civil service and become politicians afterwards. But that's something I think we really need. But as I say, I've not worked in government for very long. I've done about 8 days over 2 months. Joe, Munira, and Bryan, I guess I didn't know you were a civil servant in Singapore as well. Have much more experience, and I'm very keen to sort of hear from them to see if my observations are along the right lines. But thanks for having me.
Well, thank you. And yeah, one of the things you mentioned was Italy and looking at other countries, and I think that's why Bryan is here to bring a different perspective from Asia and perhaps what's worked, why it's different, if there's anything that we can learn from other parts of the world. So
thank you. So the title of my remarks today is Enhancing State Capacity by Reducing State Scope: Insights from Singapore and East Asia. Drawing from my academic research, my PhD, which I completed, my personal background, as I mentioned, I'm from Singapore. I used to be a civil servant in the Singapore government, and also, my research interests on East Asia's governance. And I apologize beforehand if any of my remarks tonight may sound offensive or controversial, because that's not my intention whatsoever. And if you find that, you are rubbed the wrong way, then you may simply dismiss me as an ignorant foreigner. I would take no offense whatsoever. So as an academic, I like to differentiate and define some key terms first. So what is state capacity? State capacity basically means the ability of the state to enforce its policy decisions. The state has certain goals. It wants to do A, B, C, D, E. If it's all talk and no action, you don't see the concrete results. We simply say there's a lack of state capacity. But this is different from another related concept, which is state scope. State scope basically refers to the range of functions that the state wishes to pursue in the first place. They are different but related. Let's consider 2 scenarios. In the first scenario, you have a situation where the state has a very wide scope. It tries to do many, many things in society, in the economy, but it has low capacity. It tries to do so many different things, and it ends up not being very good at many of the things it seeks to pursue. It has wide state scope, but low state capacity. But contrast this with a different alternative, where the state has a more limited scope. It focuses on more core functions and leaves other areas to competitive market forces and civil society to handle them better, but focuses on certain core functions where it does best. And it therefore has high state capacity focused on those core areas. So I wish to submit to all of you today that to really enhance state capacity, we should first prioritize reducing state scope. Let me use the extreme example of the Soviet Union. Okay? So, roll back 50 years, 60 years ago, right? Imagine the Soviet Union, you have central planners. They have very, very wide state scope, right? They try to do many, many things in society. They try to plan the economy and plan society. But you will not say that the problem of the Soviet Union is simply a lack of state capacity. Just by increasing training, by improving the bureaucracy, by reforming the bureaucracy, by giving the bureaucracy more funds, getting civil servants to think in a more long-term manner, these things are not just going to cut it, right? Because it's a structural problem of having too much responsibilities of the state, things that are best left to the private sector and civil society. Now, obviously, this is an extreme example, right? None of us here are Soviet central planners, and certainly most Western developed nations are not Soviet central planners. But there is a vision of government today that is circulating that is increasingly popular. One that is popularized by this individual and scholar called Mariana Mazzucato, right? Who has written the book, The Entrepreneurial State, and more recently, Mission Economy, Moonshot Guide to Capitalism. And in this vision, it's one where we increase state capacity, never mind the state scope. In fact, in this vision, it says that the state should pursue a grand and ambitious mission, and it should mobilize society around that. And just by increasing state capacity, we can fulfill this mission. We can fulfill this scope. Never mind how expansive the scope of the state is. I submit to you that this is really a foolish vision to pursue, and the state and certainly the UK should not go down this road. Why is that so? Well, academic political economists have several arguments. The first, the argument of complexity. The more ambitious the plan is, the more the scope, the greater the scope of the state, you are increasing the problem of complexity, right? And the more complex you are, the problem is you're expecting fallible policymakers to solve. Think about some of the debates we've had in the last few weeks. In the media, right? We have people saying that there's two-tier policing, right, in the United Kingdom. Whether that's true or not is beside the point. But if we have concerns about whether the state can handle policing, right? What more, you want the state to handle disruptive technology, to anticipate the next breakthrough, to handle climate change and all this grand vision? I'm truly skeptical. And then there's the argument from incentives. When you're giving the government too much power to solve a ever wide-ranging, range of functions, then you're just going to give government more power, right, over people, right? And this really is the recipe for the road to serfdom, right? That the great economist Hayek once warned about. And may I provide a historical observation from East Asia, which is my research and my interest. So East Asian states, by that I mean Korea, Japan, Taiwan, and Singapore, actually did pursue this Mazzucato-style missionary governance. I call it missionary governance. They pursued this thing called the developmental state, right? Where society in East Asia in the 60s, 70s, and 80s were mobilized around a single-minded vision of pursuing economic growth, right? And I submit to you that's actually quite unrealistic to really follow in the context of the UK and many Western developed nations. Why? Because East Asian societies were communitarian, right? And in a communitarian society, people are more willing and able to sacrifice personal interests to identify with the national goal, right, with what the government says. But in Western democracies, we are rather more individualistic, right? Imagine today if, let's say, the government says, we are going to outlaw and curb unionization. I'm going to legislate restrictions on industrial action because industrial action is going to harm economic growth and lower productivity. Would you accept that? I submit to you that most of you will actually reject that, which leads me to the second point. In order to sustain such a single-minded vision, right, to supersede what individuals want, you have to use force to suppress what individuals want. Which leads me to the second observation that East Asian states, the reason why they were rather successful in operating this sort of missionary governance is not only they were communitarian, they were rather authoritarian, right? Singapore is rather authoritarian, not fully, right, semi-authoritarian. And so they have this what we call capacity to enforce unpopular decisions onto society. So in the UK, we have this discussion of NIMBYs, right? We have interest groups and NIMBYs blocking developmental plans, right? Guess what? In Singapore, we don't have such a problem of NIMBYs, right? Because if the government sees these NIMBYs and interest groups, the government has the capacity to supersede and override their interests because it has authoritarian powers. So I submit to you that trying to pursue this sort of ambitious missionary governance where we do not care about what the scope of the state is as long as we increase capacity is unrealistic and undesirable. Unrealistic because in East Asia it was communitarian and we just do not have such a solidaristic vision as East Asia did. And undesirable because, this is not a recipe for healthy liberal democracy. You have to concentrate powers in the state if you wish to sustain and maintain a single-minded pursuit of a vision in a society where people may have their own visions and their own plans. So what then do I propose if I oppose this vision? In my alternative proposal, I would say the solution would be to limit state scope. And when we limit state scope, we are focusing state capacity in these very limited areas where the state is best equipped to handle. And yes, the unpopular conclusion that stems from this analysis is that this would expand the role for competitive market forces and civil society. Certainly. And this is really a pill that I think some people may find too bitter to swallow. And allow me to focus on this one example on healthcare and social spending. In the United Kingdom, we know in the last few decades, actually, if you look at the statistics, government spending as a share of GDP has been steadily increasing. Economic growth has been stagnant, which means that household income and wage growth has been also very stagnant. Something has to give. Something has to give. And one of the drivers of increasing government spending is healthcare and social care. Something has to give. In Singapore, right, the focus is increasing the size of the economic pie. Economic growth comes first. The secondary focus is redistribution. Because in Singapore, the focus is, if you do not increase the pie for everyone, there is nothing left to redistribute, okay? And I submit to you that really, I think a lot of Western developed democracies today really need to think about how to embrace the principle of individual self-responsibility and market incentives. And I certainly do not need to tell you that the NHS suffers from severe structural problems. It is not just an issue of a lack of funding and piecemeal changes. It's a fundamental problem, right, of too much centralization and insufficient self-responsibility and market incentives. And healthcare is related to labor market, competitiveness as well. Think about, the fact that in Singapore and in many East Asian states where, especially in history, there is no minimum wage. Unionization is curbed. Welfare, yes, there's welfare. Every country has welfare. But in Singapore, welfare is tied to work incentives, right? We don't call it welfare, we call it workfare, right? Welfare that is conditional and grounded on the principle of work comes first, right? And let me just end my remarks here by just really quoting some quotes from a very famous founding father of Singapore, not Lee Kuan Yew. Some of you are thinking Lee Kuan Yew, but I'm just going to quote from this individual called S. Rajaratnam, who was one of the social policy architects in a speech in 1982, and I can give more policy details later in Q&A. I just want to give some overall remarks, principles first. Rajaratnam says in 1982, once people believe that the government will provide everything, they lose the faculty of self-reliance or personal initiative and learning to do things for themselves. When government is considered a benevolent uncle, society degenerates into a society of lazy, greedy, and irresponsible citizens. National coffers become empty. The situation I described, Rajaratnam, is not fiction, but actual situations in the world today, not just in third world countries, underdeveloped countries, but also highly developed nations, which were once prosperous and powerful. In these countries, the degeneration began with the advent of governments who claimed that they, not the people, need work for the good things of life. The PAP government, which is Singapore, Lee Kuan Yew, the founding fathers, this division, from the start, rejected the idea that it was first government which created a prosperous society. It came to the conclusion that work created prosperity, and that the harder and more intelligently people worked, the greater the prosperity. So it's the fundamental link between work and reward. When you are doing things to cut the link between hard work and reward, you are violating this principle of meritocracy. You are starting to go down the path of redistribution and not focusing on growing the pie for all. Now, am I saying that the UK must do this 100%? Well, that's not for me to say, right? That's for voters to decide. All I'm suggesting is that if you want economic growth, you want to get things done, we have to understand fundamental economic trade-offs. If you want to grow the pie, then you have to really focus on growing the pie, not redistributing and slicing the pie in different ways. You can't have your cake and eat it too. So I submit to you that that's the fundamental challenge. These are values that voters need to decide. It's not for me to say, but it's a challenge that I pose to all of you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bryan. Lots of provocative thoughts that I'm sure we'll come back to in the chair discussion and Q&A. Over to you, Munira.
Thank you. So I found it quite difficult to prepare for the discussion this evening because when I was thinking about what are the reasons why we can't get stuff done, I couldn't pick out just 2 or 3 points. And I kept thinking about the story of the murder on the Orient Express. I don't know if you've seen the film or you know the book. So this is a spoiler, but there isn't just one murderer. There are multiple murderers, and there are lots of people stabbing the victim. And in a way, I think that is a metaphor for what's happened to the state. There are multiple causes all acting at the same time in Britain. And this is not a uniquely British problem either. This phrase, state capacity, is also being talked about quite a lot in America and probably other countries. And I think Joe's absolutely right when he said at the beginning that this is a problem that people on the left and the right are both grappling with. And it's a point of common concern, which I think does bring people together, and one of the reasons why we were keen to do this event tonight. I agree with lots of what's already been said, and I don't want to repeat too much, but I just want to pick out some of the causes, some of the kind of the stabbings, to use the metaphor. I realise it's not a very good metaphor, but that I think are worth picking out, which perhaps haven't been talked about as much. So the first is obviously, we have just gone through a short-term crisis since 2008. We had the financial crash, obviously the COVID pandemic. We have left the EU. That's also caused disruption. Then the war in Ukraine and the subsequent inflation. But all these are short-term challenges that the British state has had to deal with. But it's dealt with it in a position of relative weakness, I think. The infrastructure that the state has not been able to cope with a lot of those challenges. And one thing in particular I would point out, I think it would be remiss not to mention the underinvestment in some capital infrastructure in the UK. So it is true that we have not invested enough in the structure of the NHS, in some of our public services. There are very good reasons for that. There has been a period of fiscal austerity, and it's been very difficult to spend everything we would like. But it does mean that even with recent increases in spending on services like the NHS, we have, I think, around 11% more staff in the NHS now on the front line than we had in 2010. But we're not seeing the increase in output, and that's partly because they're working with very old equipment. They're not able to use diagnostics. The system of management within the NHS is not able to really utilise that resource. And therefore, even with an increase in spending, because there hasn't been that investment in digital technology and infrastructure and buildings, we've just seen productivity has not increased in the public sector. And I think that is quite a substantial issue, and we shouldn't ignore it. And it's already been mentioned that we haven't built enough prison places. We haven't built enough immigration detention, which is a reason why people are being put up in hotels, which is more costly. So cuts that have been made, cuts which, whether you agree or not, were for the right reasons or the right choices, but they were cuts that were made in the last 10 years. Although, actually, the British state has long been characterised by not spending enough on capital, even before 2008. And there have been, generally there's been more investment in labour than in capital and in technology. And so I think that we have suffered as a result of that. And there have been some investments more recently in the spending review. When I was in government, there were efforts to invest more in productivity. And I know that other organisations, the Tony Blair Institute has talked a lot about using technology to try and improve public sector productivity. But, if you want to know why the waiting lists are so big, it's partly COVID, but it's also just, we have to modernise some of our public services. So, there are lots of other examples of that I could name in the States. So that's a kind of technocratic argument for, things we can do to improve the system. And I'm, fairly optimistic that we can use intelligence to tackle that problem. But it's not just about investment. As Sam's already pointed out, there are lots of onerous processes and regulations in the country that mean that even when we do invest in capital infrastructure, it takes a long time to get anything built. And there are lots of delays. There's a vetocracy in certainly in transport infrastructure, but also energy infrastructure. So something like HS2, which is or was a huge investment, a huge cost to the public purse, that budget grew as a result of many delays, of objections being voiced by campaign groups, changes to the original design to try and accommodate people's objections. So a budget that started at around 30 to 40 billion was then forecast to grow to around 100 billion. And that is, Sam's pointed out, just a universal problem with all infrastructure building. So that's not really about how much we spend. It's the fact that we can't seem to spend wisely or effectively to deal with this instability in the policy process and in the planning process. And that's in a sense, it's a man-made problem. It's something that's been embedded in our systems and in expectations when people try to think about these big ambitious projects. It's almost now, as a country, we almost don't believe it's possible to build on that scale and any speed. And I think that tends to dampen ambition and tends to dampen people's ideas. Thirdly, though, I think as well as the external planning system, which is a problem, and I think left and right can unite around the need to reform that system, I think there are problems within government itself, and the onerous processes of trying to get approval for anything within government, within Whitehall in particular, is one of the reasons why it's very difficult to get things done. So I would say that the Treasury's processes for spending reviews tends to make it very difficult for departments to plan long term. Often there is a scepticism about long term thinking and projects within departments. There is sometimes reluctance to give funding settlements for a period of time, which means that departments and the NHS and other public services can't plan long term because they think that they're going to see an end to their funding within 12 months, or they don't get approvals in time, so they can't go out and procure. So even with the funding that we have, even despite external delays, government itself just makes it very difficult to get things done. And that's entirely, again, a man-made problem. And it's something, I think, to do with the mindset within government about not wanting to commit long-term or do long-term thinking, because there's a reluctance, in a sense, for the state to do some of these core basic things, not the kinds of things that Bryan is talking about, which is to revive industry, or just basic core things like planning the investment in border force, or planning in kind of basic functions of the state. There's also a lot of overregulation and compliance. So every time there's a failing somewhere in the system, there's a pressure on politicians to say something must be done to fix that mistake, fix that problem, make sure it never happens again. And that adds another layer of compliance and checks to the front line, which means that the front line has to tick more boxes in order to get stuff done. If you look at a sector like children's social care, it's now very difficult for people working in that sector to spend time with the families they're supposed to be helping, because there is now so much paperwork. There's a very good report by Josh McAllister, who's now, I think, going to be a Labour candidate in the next election, who's worked in that field, and has talked about just the amount of time that's now spent trying to comply with processes. And there is a culture of risk aversion that's grown up, I think, in the state, partly because of these new demands that politicians make on the state to make sure mistakes never happen, accidents never happen, with good intention, but it does mean that the quality of public services declines as a result. But also, I think there's a growth in general kind of fear of legal challenge. If people inside government make a mistake, all the incentives are to avoid doing anything, because if you don't do anything, you can't be challenged for it legally. So there is a pressure, I think, and there's a rise of judicial activism, which is partly driving that fear and that internal sense of stasis. I think Bryan's absolutely right. The state does lots of things that it shouldn't be doing. I was looking the other day at an advert that was for a job, a period dignity officer in Scotland, in Tayside. This is someone to advertise the Period Dignity Act that the Scottish Government passed. The Scottish Government now provides period products requires all public institutions to provide free period products to women to ensure period dignity. This is a country that has a recruitment crisis in schools, that can't recruit enough teachers. Now, I think that is a misallocation of human capital, of resources, of priorities. And that is, a condition that I think affects lots of government departments. Obviously, that was Scotland, but the government in England has a period product scheme in schools, and again, it was under pressure from campaign groups. So there are lots of things that people expect the state to do, which it can't do brilliantly. But there are basic core functions that the state is no longer able to do and is not delivering on. But the final thing I wanted to say is a lot of the discussion about state capacity tends to focus on competence, expanded scope, processes, over-regulation. All these things are absolutely right. But another side to this, if we're being honest, is that it's also about a set of values and attitudes, which is often in opposition or in disjuncture with public opinion about what needs to be done. And so if you take an issue like immigration, which the public repeatedly over many, many years has said they want to see a reduction overall in immigration, and they're frustrated that the government can't do it. The reason that the British state is not delivering lower immigration is not because of competence, it's not because there aren't enough resources, it's because a political choice has been made. And you could argue whether that's the civil service. The civil service has a disliking of that political desire from the public. And I think if you looked at the Home Office, there's clearly some tension within the Home Office workforce about whether it should be trying to reduce immigration or not. I think that's fairly well documented. The union representing lots of Home Office staff is challenging the government at the moment over its policy on illegal immigration. But I think it's also a choice that politicians have made. And ultimately, when we talk about state capacity, it's very easy for people to default to blaming Whitehall or saying that the civil service is at fault and the civil service is failing. But ultimately, politicians are in charge. Politicians can decide to amend the planning system. Politicians can decide to invest resources into different parts of the system, into capital. Politicians can decide to change the system around something like immigration. It might be contentious, it might be difficult, but that's a decision. To govern is to choose. And I think that state capacity is a very important thing to fix, but it's not the only reason why the public is dissatisfied with government and with the political system. And I think both Labour and Conservatives will have to, even with a brilliant, incredibly effective and efficient state, will still have to deal with that fundamental question of what is government for and what are we trying to deliver. And that is ultimately a political and ideological challenge that they have to decide what their opinion is on these issues.
Thank you. So I'm just going to ask each of the panelists one question because we want to get to the floor and we don't have lots of time. So the first question I wanted to ask you, Joe, is that there were many different things mentioned, whether that was health or other forms of infrastructure. Is there something that links all of them together? Because what seem like ostensibly very different issues, immigration, National Health Service, the challenges or the sense that they are not, that the government isn't responding effectively or achieving its goals, seem to run through all of them. Is there something that you would say is similar in the challenges in all of those issues?
I think there are plenty of things that are different, for sure, and you have to take things on their own merits. But you are right, there are some things which are similar, and I think that the things which are similar are the things that's worth government thinking about. I think that I talked a bit about a kind of political economy choice where it's maybe to the short-term interests of people not to care about this much, but all of those problems we talk about, like the public want to see change on all of those things, and the kind of common feature of them is it's actually hard to change the problem that you see every day without changing some of those problems that sit behind the scenes, the things we've all talked about procurement or legal activism or planning or things like that. Like those things aren't problems politicians, I think, feel like they're hearing about directly. They're secondary problems, but they are actually the only ones that matter in the long run because they unlock everything else. And one of the things I was reflecting on recently about the time I spent in the civil service is government bounces between things a lot. And I think any situation which is set up where the way you make policy is someone turns around to you and says, next week is crime week, what are we doing on crime? It's probably not a great way of running the system around the media. And I think we've optimized too much for the kind of what are we going to announce now, what will the public directly care about, and maybe not optimized enough about what are the repeat problems that are coming up. And every time I would be in one of those crime week or health week or whatever it is situations, the things like planning or procurement or pay would come up and we'd say, we'll get to those later. And I spent 7 years in the civil service and I don't think we ever did get to those later. And you have to get to them today, unfortunately. So that's maybe the common thread.
Mm. And Sam, you mentioned incentives. What incentives need to change for politicians to respond to some of the things that we've been talking about?
So, I think what you need is effectively politicians to be aware that there may be a political cost to supporting development, but there's also a long-term political cost to opposing every single development. And you can kind of see it now in part of the Conservative Party's recent issues. Perhaps if more homes were built over the past 10 or so years, you probably would see slightly larger proportion of young people wanting to vote for them. They'd also see that. I think the other thing is also, the broader economic conditions there too, right? If we were building at a rate, then there's going to be a sort of growth dividend. And, Joe mentioned announcements, but one of the frustrating things about announcement is they're not just short term, but most people aren't paying attention to policy announcements unless you've got a really, really good one. It's probably just going to get completely lost, and they'll end up voting based on a sort of finger in the air. Is the economy, is the NHS, is whatever actually working right now? So you've got to show them that there is that long-term incentive, but obviously it's all well and good saying basically we're going to appeal to the sort of better angels of your nature, and this is the right thing, and it's in the long term it is right, but they might say it's the right thing in 10 years' time, but they care about the next election, which is maybe 2 years away. And I think on that front, what you need to do is what we're trying to do, which is identifying all those people who do support development and giving them a voice in the political process, and making sure that they, just as they consult the existing groups or all those opposed things, that there's also that counterweight, which I think clearly can exist, but doesn't exist by default unless you organise.
And Bryan, I mean, you obviously talked about that there's a lot of things that the state shouldn't be doing, essentially, that it is doing. I mean, from your, obviously, comparative perspective from Singapore and the UK, do you feel that there are certain things, because obviously there's specific things like Munira mentioned, like the period dignity officer or something, but is there, are there particular whole departments or areas of governance that we are currently doing at the moment that you think that actually we should not be doing that?
So I think rather than answering your question in a very specific way, I would say that from my experience of Singapore, really, the officials in Singapore, we are really obsessed with economic growth. Okay? Economic growth is really something that we pursue extremely zealously. We wake up every day, we think, what can we do to pursue economic growth? Now, it's very easy to say we want economic growth, but what does it actually mean in practice? Because sometimes economic growth, right, can cause certain trade-offs, right, with other values that we may also hold dear. So I strongly believe that we get the government that we want is based on people's beliefs. The government that we have is really a reflection on people's values. Okay? If people have the wrong values, or values which are not, celebrating economic growth, then you are going to have politicians and a system that does not champion economic growth. Let me give you a very specific example, which is that of environmentalism. Okay? So in Asian countries and where I come from, environmentalism is very important, yes? We care about the environment, we care about saving the animals and the trees, but we do not see economic growth as the problem. It is with economic growth that we get the sort of technology and innovation, right, to creatively solve environmental problems. But in many Western countries, especially when I read the news today, there is this idea that economic growth is really part of the problem. And may I suggest to you, that this is really, I think, partly a cultural problem, it's partly an ideological problem. So just to give you a specific example, I think a few weeks ago, I was speaking to some students because I teach part-time, in some of the schools in the UK. And a student came up to me and said, hey, recently, teacher, I read a certain book on degrowth. Right? There is this perspective out there which says, if you want to pursue, environmental change, you need to have lesser consumption and lesser economic growth. Well, I submit to you, if that's the sort of rhetoric that we are going to have, that children are receiving, then that's not a very good cultural environment to really pursue economic growth. So I think before we talk about priorities of government and policy change and departments and all that, we need to reflect on how we are discussing and approaching and perceiving economic growth in the public sphere today, because I think that's the root of the issue.
And finally, Munira, is there anything new or different about what we're seeing? Because we think about, leaders in the 20th century, and were these challenges the same? Did they have those same questions about state capacity and so on? Because there's been great change that has happened kind of economically and in society over the last few decades. What's different about the last couple decades, which it seems that things have got worse?
So I think some things have changed. I mean, there's in a sense, part of the problem that we're discussing is inherent to liberal democracies. When you have the instability of regular elections, it's very hard to plan 10, 20 years down the line. And that's been a constant problem. And it's a problem that lots of other countries, as Bryan's talked about, haven't had to the same extent. But I think the things that have changed are we have Britain itself has gone through a period of economic stagnation, which has meant underinvestment in some things, which has affected the quality of public services and the sort of the day-to-day living experience for lots of people. But also it's affected cost of living more generally. So it contributes to the sense of things are just not working overall. And that's a longer, more complicated discussion about what's happened to our economy in the last 20 years. And even preceding that, we've had a problem with productivity for several decades. I think also that the way in which Whitehall works has become more bureaucratized, and there is less expertise for lots of reasons. We don't pay people enough, we don't train them enough, we don't take seriously enough the importance of good quality people. People are not attracted into those roles. So the raw material you have to work with, the functions that you have to deliver, you don't have necessarily, you're not attracting the country's best talent into those roles. So I think that's changed. But, as I said at the end of my remarks, I think one of the biggest problems is that politics itself feels exhausted. And in the past, I think it would have been easier to distinguish between the main political parties, what their vision for the future was. I think the issue of economic growth was just more recognised as an objective of government to pursue prosperity and to talk about it in those terms and to see that as the number one priority or a very high priority. And for a very long time in Britain, there was just a general expectation of increasing prosperity. I think we have lost confidence in our ability and the state's ability to do that. And I don't think it necessarily means that the state is responsible or is the driver of economic growth, but it has to do certain things in order for economic growth to happen. It has to ensure that there is broad safety on the streets. If you live in a town where there is just endemic shoplifting on the high street, it's very hard to encourage businesses to open up there. If you live in an area where you only have a bus once an hour to your local town centre to get a job, it's very hard to motivate people to go out and work. So there are just certain things which the state needs to be able to deliver, which it's not doing. And I think that is depressing economic growth. So it's in answer to your question about the individual people who are running the country, and this is, I think, not a party political point about Labour or Conservatives. I think it is important that the political parties have an analysis of what's gone wrong and be able to set out how they would address them in the future. And civil service reform is, in some ways, quite a boring topic, but I think it's something that they have to have a view on. And this bigger point about what do they prioritise, what do they think are the ultimate goals of their government, and what are they prepared to sacrifice? Are they prepared to see certain things, certain rules changed? Are they prepared to challenge some of the stakeholder groups and the vested interests in order to deliver that priority? And I think that's what you would want politicians to do.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we're going to open it up to the floor. So solutions, questions, challenges, counter arguments, and other thoughts. So please put your hand up, and we'll take probably 2 or 3 at a time, and then go back to the floor. So hands up. Okay. We'll go to the gentleman. Yes.
One of the examples of where we have got stuff done and why they work.
Very good question. And also.
Yeah, is it all right if I address the question to Munira directly? Munira, one of my jobs is to explain this country to Americans. It's very difficult. That's not the Americans' fault. One of the things you mentioned was Brexit and the disruption caused by Brexit. I'm interested, I think you see that as a short-term problem, but I'm very interested to know whether anything's changed for you since 2016 when you were pro-Brexit. How do you feel about it now?
Okay, we'll take one more question.
I want to ask the panel's view about whether technology has the state capacity and how, in a way, individuals can be protected from this technology and has state capacity that we don't become victim of sort of digital authoritarianism.
Thank you. So we had a question on what examples of when the state's done things successfully and why that was, Brexit and the effect it's had, and also the role of technology. So do you want to start, Munira?
Yeah. So an example of success, well, the vaccine is the obvious one to point to. Very unusual circumstances. You're shutting down the entire economy and locking people in their homes. So when you do the economic value assessment in the Treasury, it's pretty straightforward. You could spend a lot of money and it would still be worth doing. And I think that is one of the reasons why the vaccine project was very successful. They didn't have to jump through as many hoops in terms of getting the investment, the funding from government. But I think the other reasons are you had excellent people in charge. You had Kate Bingham. She was able to assemble a fantastic team of people from inside and outside government. Crucially, she was able to recruit from outside government and bring in expertise from industry. And they were able to use common sense to deal with lots of the regulations and speed things up. There was a really concerted effort. It was a moonshot and it was very successful because in a way, we've been very negative and gloomy in some ways, but Britain has this incredible array of talent. It does have expertise in lots of areas. I don't think we harness it as well as we could. It's hard to recreate the same conditions that they had in the vaccine task force because we're not in wartime now, we're in peacetime. But I think sadly, I don't think the lessons have been learned. I don't think we've necessarily brought across or translated across the good things about that process. And the COVID inquiry, hopefully, when it eventually reports, which will be several years from now, might make some recommendations. The other thing to point out, by the way, about the vaccine task force is that, and Kate Bingham writes about it in her really great, fantastic book. I recommend it. She talks about how, as soon as they got going, the National Audit Office started doing an investigation into them and how well the project was going. She said, we barely started. Can you just give us a moment to breathe? And I think that's a very good example of where the process starts to dominate any common sense about the outcome and just let them get on with the job and then look at it afterwards. And I think that goes to this point I was making about kind of risk aversion and a kind of culture of over-accountability. Someone asked a question about Brexit. I still believe it was the right decision to leave the EU, and I know that that's not a popular view, and it's increasingly hard to defend. I always thought that it would be short-term disruption, and we talk a lot about politicians not doing enough long-term thinking. I think in the long term, I still think it's the right thing because one of the problems that we have with state capacity in the UK is the way in which lots of external processes or regulations, which are not decided by politicians, tend to constrain political choices. And I think the EU setting legislation that then can't be revised by the public is anti-democratic. And I think in the long term, it's not in the interests of the UK in terms of trying to drive economic growth or deliver good social outcomes in the country. So yes, I know it's an unpopular position, but I still believe for reasons of democracy, it was the right thing. And I do believe that democracy is very important to all these other outcomes that we want to achieve. I'll leave it there.
Thank you. Sam, do you want to pick up on it?
Yeah, a few thoughts. So I guess to sort of answer the first and the third question together. So one area in terms of improving our public services that crosses over with this sort of technology point is around data. And the UK has set up some pretty impressive kind of big picture data research projects to do with health. So there's a UK Biobank, which is a really valuable resource in terms of it's a really big database with lots and lots of people's genetic information. It's used for lots and lots of studies. Something they've recently done that I think is pretty cool is they're doing a sort of 5 million person, and this is sort of building off the biobank idea, sort of longitudinal study where the NHS is working with a bunch of research organisations. And in theory, once I've taken part in this study, which you just do a pinprick test and they take your blood pressure and they check you're not lying about your height like people do on dating apps and that sort of thing. Once you've given them all that information, they have your NHS record and they can work out over time, do people with this lifestyle or do people with this genetic background, etc., are they more likely to get heart disease? Are they more likely to get this, that, or the other disease? And I think that is going to be really transformative, and that's the kind of thing to probably be like quite proud of the state doing. But how much we can actually use those data insights, that really depends on sort of the consent of the public. And I think probably we hear a bit too much from people who want to sort of present the sort of maybe paranoid, what could go wrong side of things, and don't present the opportunities there. Imagine an NHS where you do an appointment and the first 10 minutes of that appointment weren't just answering a questionnaire that you've already answered about 100 times. This is possible if we have a better approach to data, but at the moment we don't. And again, it's like all the problems where you need to change people's minds on that. And I think also on the vaccine point, I think it is an illustration perhaps that what state capacity isn't just dependent on what the government is doing at any one time, but whether they can essentially flex into new areas and do them effectively without, perhaps if the UK had a big vaccine service for a really, really long time, they might not have been as effective because they might have become this sort of, bureaucracy that is sort of looking for problems and not quite solving the ones they should be. But the fact that they were able to just draw on that private sector expertise is a reminder that perhaps, the state can do lots of things in an emergency that it's perhaps not good for them to run in normal times. And I think it's worth thinking about that, particularly also with things like manufacturing, right? We want to be able in a war potentially to shift lots of manufacturing to making all those shells that we forgot to make in the meantime. That kind of expertise from industry is like a hidden sort of thing in state capacity that I think hasn't been touched on yet.
Jody?
Sure. Yeah. So I guess on what's worked well and what hasn't, the one thing I'd observe of some of the examples we're talking about is quite often those have been had to be taken out of a lot of the traditional government processes in order to be effective really quickly. And I don't think there is enough reflection in government on why that is. The NAO example is maybe like a very early stage one. There are plenty of others, but like if I think about the free schools program, if I think about vaccine effort or ARIA, which I talked about earlier, like those are all examples of having to like basically remove something from the day-to-day system. I think one corollary to that is like we don't want all of government to work like that all of the time, and it's very easy. Like I work for a tech company, it's very easy to get obsessed with startup culture, but lots of government, we wouldn't want to experience the same failure rates as startup culture, right? So some process, some regulation, these are good things. When you're not in one of those kind of take it outside of the system, try and do something really fast places, I think the only other way that things really get done is with like at quite extreme levels of sponsorship and project management from number 10 or the Treasury, or ideally both. Like you'd be amazed at how much kind of day-to-day putting in meetings, holding people to account that thing takes. But those are my observations on what's worked and why. On technology, I think your question was about like how much government can protect us from it.
Sort of technology enhance the state capacity, government become more powerful.
But
How individual.
yeah, so there's a great book on this I read a few years ago by a guy called Jamie Bartlett, who talked about how he thought the outcome of the software revolution was that big tech companies would become very powerful and government would become very powerful, and citizens would lose out. And I think we've definitely seen that with big tech companies. We've not seen that as much with government, and I think like government really struggles to operationalize new technology in lots of ways. But like it's very hard for government to put the genie back in the bottle on technology. Like I think these things are going to happen anyway. They're going to happen in the market. They're going to happen in other countries, and government just needs to learn to do that better. Look, I should say, look, I work for an AI company, and we do a lot of work with government, and it's great. And like, if you want to find out more about it, I'm very happy to talk afterwards. Like some of the examples, what we find really hard are that government does a lot of very experimental technology work. And is very difficult at like moving that to mass production. And when it does that really, really quickly without the work in between, that's when you tend to get some of the really bad outcomes that I think you're worried about with government just overreaching, because it's not worked out how to do this at scale and it suddenly tries to do it. So often, I think that's what people are most worried about, and government needs to have a way of doing that. That's probably my take.
Just quick remarks, sorry, Brian.
So I have 2 points. The first one is that has the UK government done anything well? I would say that the UK government has been really good in terms of trade deals. Yeah. From my observation, at least, it seems like the various agencies and individuals in charge have done a pretty good job since Brexit of pursuing various trade deals and agreements with many other countries around the world. I think that's a great achievement on top of vaccines and many others. But I find it interesting that, trade deals are something that happens outside of the country, right? Where if you're successful in this area, that you don't really have to navigate all the domestic stakeholders. So it's very interesting that that is an area which I think is very, very successful. And then for the question on technology, right? So I want to answer your question in a bit more of an indirect way. So there is a trade-off, right? So if let's say we want innovation and AI and all this great technology, you need to have permissionless innovation and creative destruction, right? An environment that does that. But then the risk, right, is that the private sector may engage in certain unscrupulous behavior, exploitation, and certain dangerous, developments could come up, right? And then if let's say we want the government to protect us from digital authoritarianism from the private sector, then the government will have to come in, regulate a little bit more, and then that has the other problem of the government then using this technology for maybe unsavory ends, right? So there is a certain trade-off here, right? So the point is that if we want economic growth, there are certain costs and trade-offs that we have to accept. Right, so it's not for me to say what the sweet spot is. It's really a decision, I think, for every society to decide, as long as we know what the trade-offs are.
Thank you. Yeah, we'll take quite a few questions because we don't have lots of time.
All right, thank you. It seems to me that there probably is some kind of consensus that we've got things wrong and the state is inefficient and ineffective in so many ways. And that, in fact, the role of government should be strategic more than micromanaging. But I don't think we're going to be able to achieve a better way unless mainstream political parties sign up to the change. But there doesn't appear to be any sign that the mainstream political parties, I mean Conservative and Labour, appear to want to sign up to the change. Maybe there's a little glimmer in the SDP, probably not the Liberal Democrats. How can we make the mainstream political parties sign up to the change?
Okay. You, Brian?
The question of devolution, we talked a lot about centralisation of power and forcing issues through. But is the sort of political economy situation and problems maybe solved better through devolution? And is that how you maybe actually give autonomy to sort of areas to deal with the issues that they face?
Okay. A few other hands up I saw. Okay.
Oh. Hello. I just wanted to ask, in terms of limiting the scope of the state, I think Argentina have elected a guy wielding a chainsaw. So is that the way to limit the scope of the state? Would you say? And if not, what limits the scope of the state to focus on the things that people really want?
Okay, we'll take.
I just wanted to ask a question about cabinet and kind of recruiting into cabinet. Does the panel have any thoughts about the method of finding talented people outside of politics and then making them laws and then putting them into the cabinet? Regardless of who actually was recently appointed as Foreign Secretary, is that generally still like the of recruiting into cabinet to find talented people?
Thank you. Behind at the back there.
It doesn't really follow that reducing the scope of the state necessarily improves state capacity. Arguably, we reduced the scope of the state in the 30 years and we haven't increased capacity.
Yeah, that's a very good point. We'll take 2 more questions. So if you want to ask a question. Yeah?
Thanks. It's often said that, and it's even been said today, I think, that liberal democracy isn't very good at thinking in sort of medium and long term. But is that actually right? I mean, if you think about massive infrastructure projects that this country has done, obviously during semi-democratic periods, what's changed?
What would you ask the people in this room to do?
Fair enough. Okay, so we have a question about mainstream parties. How do we get them to sign up to some of the things that we're talking about? The role of devolution, Someone pointed to Argentina and how they have a government committed to reducing the size of the state, recruitment into cabinet, and how reducing scope hasn't necessarily improved things in certain areas, and also what's changed recently. So we'll go in a different order. Bryan, do you want to pick up?
Yes. So for the Argentina question, that is that guy has a very interesting personality. That's for sure. That's saying the least. Well, when I say cutting the scope of the state, definitely, I'm not like, he's holding a chainsaw, right? Trying to slash all these different departments. Well, the irony here is that when you want to cut the scope of the state, sometimes you actually need the state to do that in the first place, right? Because, for example, when you want to privatize, when you want to do certain market-based supply-side reforms, the irony is that you actually need a lot of the state to plan the pace and the sequence of these reforms. So that's actually the irony. So by no means am I saying, right, throw out this department, throw out this department, throw out this department, and therefore we solve the problem. That's not what I'm saying. We need a very piecemeal, careful approach to examine various departments, various programs, to do it in a very incremental way. Let me provide this very specific example. So I'm actually writing a policy paper now on the use of regulatory sandboxes. So I think the United Kingdom has done very well when it comes to using regulatory sandboxes, when it comes to, let's say, financial technology. That's actually a very good policy that the UK can really scale up. And I think, so regulatory sandbox, right, is a very controlled attempt to deregulate a certain sector in a very limited sense. So the government is going to identify a specific sector, certain firms, and then these firms, right, will have lower regulatory compliance for a specific period of time. Then the government is going to review that and then perhaps revise policies and revise regulations over time, right? So it's a form of rules-based economic policy focused on a certain area. And I think my argument is that we can scale that up to more industries. So that's a very specific market-based sort of policy, which does require government design, government planning, but nonetheless one that facilitates innovation and competition from the private sector. So it's not like a government free-for-all where we just hold a chainsaw and shut down these departments. That's very simplistic market reforms. It's certainly not what I advocate. And this actually relates back to the devolution question. I don't believe, right, that pure devolution is actually the solution, because sometimes so much devolution can actually create very complicated rules for people and we are not sure where to go to. So actually my policy of regulatory sandboxes actually ironically does require some sort of a central body at the national level to implement. Right? We need to design the policy in a centralized way, and then all firms will follow, will go through that. But nonetheless, it's a framework. It's a government-created framework that does allow for bottom-up innovation and choice, right? So it's a careful approach to design, right? That we need to adopt. I'm developing more, on that front. Yeah.
And Joe.
Yeah, I'll take a couple of them quickly. On devolution, yeah, absolutely. The one I like, I think no government that's signing off which bits of the country get a chess table in a public park is like quite tackling that issue right. And some of these things I think government needs to decide it's not in the business of, so it can focus. Like focus is key, and I think I was really right about that. Recruiting into cabinet through unusual mechanisms, yes, yeah, basically I think that sounds like a good idea. I think more diversity of talent, more diversity of people is a good thing. We should try it, notwithstanding the specific example from last week. On the question of what would you like people in this room to do? There are loads of different things, and all the standard things like you should run for office, like apply. You could join the civil service and put in loads of special pay requests and procurement exemptions until the Treasury come knocking and say, what are you doing? And that's also a very good idea, I think. But the one thing I'd say, which I think is common to that and the liberal democracy point, is I think the thing we've lost is a constituency in this country for a strong, capable state. Like everyone has a view of what they want from the state. Quite a lot of these positions have been put in place or in process or in kind of in power through things like the planning system, procurement systems, the defence industrial complex, things like that. And we don't have anyone who's just on the side that broadly the state should be able to do the things it says it does. And like maybe that's everyone in this room, but we need to find a way to build that campaign. So yeah, that'd be my take.
Sure. So I guess to go for the point about the scope of the state, right? I don't know if we have cut the scope of the state. I think the state basically has the same functions as it had before, perhaps has more functions. It just does them worse. So there's a difference between, you know, identifying what you want the state to do and funding it properly, and also, you know, decide, you know, having all these different functions but then not funding them properly. And I think we're probably, you know, we're not sort of, there was no point where we said, okay, we're not going to have an NHS and we're going to do a private system here, or we're not going to have a planning system and we're going to go to something radically different. The state actually is relatively similar. The difference is that it has larger funding requirements, and those funding requirements aren't being met through various reasons, particularly low growth. On the question of appointments to cabinet, I'd probably frame it slightly differently in that I think probably it's too hard to get rid of the UK system where, you know, you have people standing in Parliament taking these cabinet posts. But what would be good is if those people had much more power to appoint their own team. You know, ministers might have a few spads, maybe 2, 3, 4, but realistically it's mostly not their own people, and most of those hiring decisions aren't down to them. And if they want to, say, bring in someone from the private sector who has a track record in running large organisations but might require slightly different payment structures, might not have gone through the traditional civil service system, that's really, really difficult for them. So if we can make that kind of thing easier, I think there would be a lot more progress. And I guess I'm biased on that because I am a person who's sort of been appointed kind of through a slightly confusing route that isn't open in general, I guess. But that kind of thing, I think, is probably the path forward. In terms of devolution, right? So I'm sceptical of the view that basically you give as much decision-making power as possible down to the lowest level and you just get good outcomes, right? I think the thing that needs to be there is the incentive structure and not just the political accountability, but also things like fiscal accountability too. So at the moment, you have local governments have very little incentive to grow. If they approve new developments, that means they potentially have lots of social care requirements to meet in the future. It means they might need to sort something about education places and all different things like that. So they actually get a lot of burdens, and you can give them great flexibility to think about skills and all these things. But unless you have some sort of fiscal link between what they're doing and those outcomes, then there's a problem. So coming up with better ways of actually giving them revenue raising powers, whether that's through tax revenues that are more buoyant. So things like, if an area is doing well, stamp duty receipts will like all of a sudden jump up in those areas. Business rates will go up, but at the moment that money sort of goes centrally. So if you allow places to capture more of that uplift, then I think you'll get better decision making. But unless you solve that part of the problem, if you just give mayors loads of powers, they'll probably just spend as badly as councils spend at the moment. If you give them real fiscal accountability, that will change.
You win it? Yeah, so I think there are some short-term fixes which could help. So I do think bringing some people in from outside with expertise is helpful. And you know, actually in the last few years, governments have brought in people into the House of Lords, and it's been successful. So I would favour that, and bringing in special advisors with policy expertise or delivery expertise, I think is also worthwhile. But there is a longer term problem, which is you do need people to want to go into public life and to take ministerial jobs, to become MPs, to become senior civil servants. It is hard to do. And to incentivise people to do that. And even when people go into the system, keeping them in the system is hard. And also those people tend to be attracted, the really talented people go into policy roles. But actually, if people are looking for advice on what they could do in their career to help fix this problem, I think going into delivery roles in government is really worthwhile. You know, it's delivery where most of these problems are encountered in terms of delays and funding issues and efficiencies. So I think trying to encourage people who are interested in politics to think about delivery is really important. There are a lot more delivery jobs as well, and it's I think something that is not well understood. And then, I mean, just quickly on devolution. I mean, I'm actually in favour of devolving more in principle, and I think it's crazy that Number 10 in the Treasury do have so much control over how so much of the country operates. But we should also recognise that is in itself also a disruption, and there isn't necessarily a kind of huge swell of people at ground level, talented people who can make those decisions. As I mean, I don't know if it's fair to say there are fewer of them around the country, but it's not automatically given that you will have a brilliant infrastructure locally to be able to do things better than at national level either. And it just takes time to grow that. If you give power, good people tend to come, but it takes time. There's a lag effect. And so that's one of the reasons why I think government has traditionally been reluctant to do it. And maybe whoever's next in charge will be tempted to. But you do give something up and you take a risk when you do it.
Well,
Sorry, does anyone want to try and answer my question?
Sorry, I'll give it a go, because I think how do we get them to sign up? I mean, part of the purpose of Civic Future is to do events like this, to invite people to talk about these issues, to raise it as an issue on the agenda, but also to try and encourage people who are going into politics to see this as a priority and something important.
Can you see traction?
I mean, we've only been going for a year, but the fact that this room is full, we have a room capacity issue as well as state capacity.
Deeper level, politically, because I can't see the traction.
Look, I mean, I think both people in both political parties, the main political parties, are interested in it, and they see that there's a problem. They have different political agendas. I mean, not sure how different, but they say they have different political agendas. They'll each encounter, in their own way, some resistance and some friction in trying to deliver that agenda. And we talked about some of the technical issues and some of the kind of broader legal issues as well.
Well, hopefully, as Munira said, trying to encourage more people to enter public life, talented people. Hopefully, many of you are already working in public life or are strongly considering it. But we just want to give a big round of applause to our fantastic panel.